What if I told you that a short, foreign-born artillery officer once conquered most of Europe, crowned himself emperor, and then lost it all in just 20 years? This is the incredible story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who rose from literally nothing to become the most powerful person on Earth, only to die alone on a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. The story begins in 1769 on the island of Corsica. Yes, Napoleon wasn't even French when he was born. Corsica had just been sold to France by the Italian city-state of Genoa the year before. Napoleon's family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. His father was a lawyer who managed to get young Napoleon a scholarship to military school in mainland France. And this is where the future emperor got his first taste of what would define his entire life. He was an outsider, a short kid with a thick Corsican accent, surrounded by French nobles' sons who mocked his background and his height. But Napoleon had something they didn't, an absolutely obsessive work ethic and a mind like a steel trap. While other kids were partying, Napoleon was reading military histories and studying mathematics. He graduated from military school at just 16 years old and became a second lieutenant in the artillery. Now, artillery might sound boring, but it was actually the cutting edge of 18th century warfare. While other officers saw it as unglamorous, Napoleon understood that cannons were the future of battle. Then, in 1789, everything changed. The French Revolution erupted, and suddenly the whole world was turned upside down. Kings were being executed, nobles were fleeing the country, and chaos reigned supreme. For most people, this was terrifying. For Napoleon, this was an opportunity. Here's where Napoleon's story gets insane. In 1793, when he was just 24 years old, he found himself at the siege of Toulon. The city had been taken by the British, and the French Republican Army was struggling to get it back. The artillery commander had been wounded, and they needed someone, anyone, who knew what they were doing. Enter Napoleon. He looked at the situation and basically said, "You're all doing this wrong." He repositioned the cannons, focused fire on the key British positions, and within days, Toulon fell. Overnight, he went from unknown lieutenant to brigadier general at 24 years old. But the real breakthrough came in 1796 when Napoleon was given command of the French army in Italy. Remember, this guy had never led a major campaign before. The army he inherited was demoralized, underpaid, and basically falling apart. Napoleon's first move, he gathered his officers and made them a promise. "I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power." What happened next was military genius in action. In a series of lightning-fast campaigns, Napoleon defeated Austrian and Piedmontese forces that should have crushed him. He didn't just win battles, he revolutionized how wars were fought. Traditional European warfare was slow and methodical. Napoleon was fast and unpredictable. He would concentrate his forces, strike hard at the enemy's weakest point, then move on before they could respond. It was like playing chess while everyone else was still learning checkers. By 1797, Napoleon had conquered most of northern Italy and was dictating terms to the Austrian Empire. The Directory back in Paris suddenly realized they had a problem. Their general was becoming more popular than the government itself. Their solution? Send him as far away as possible. In 1798, they gave Napoleon command of an expedition to Egypt. The official goal was to disrupt British trade routes to India. The real goal? Get this dangerous young general out of France. The Egyptian campaign was both a triumph and a disaster. Napoleon won every battle on land, but the British destroyed his fleet, stranding his army. But here's the brilliant part. Napoleon controlled the narrative. He sent back reports that made him sound like Alexander the Great reborn, conquering ancient lands and discovering Egyptian mysteries. In 1799, Napoleon made a decision that would change history forever. He basically said, "Screw this," abandoned his army in Egypt, and sailed back to France in secret. Technically, this was desertion and could have gotten him shot. Instead, he found a country in chaos. The Directory was falling apart. France was at war with most of Europe. The economy was collapsing, and people were desperate for strong leadership. Napoleon saw his moment and took it. On November 9th, 1799, known as 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon staged one of history's most successful coups. But here's what's crazy, he almost blew it. When he addressed the legislature, they started shouting, "Down with the dictator!" Napoleon panicked and had to be rescued by his brother, but his supporters rallied, the military backed him, and by the end of the day, Napoleon was one of 3 consuls ruling France. Of course, we all know how sharing power worked out for Napoleon. As first consul, Napoleon was basically a dictator, but a popular one. He stabilized the currency, made peace with the Catholic Church, and created the Napoleonic Code, a legal system so good that many countries still use versions of it today. But Napoleon wasn't satisfied with just being the power behind the throne. In 1804, he took the final step. In a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, with the Pope himself in attendance, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. Think about that for a second. A man who had been born a foreign subject, who grew up as an outsider, who started as a junior military officer, had just declared himself emperor. It was one of the most audacious power grabs in human history. And for about a decade, it looked like Napoleon could do no wrong. This was the period of the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon was basically playing grand strategy in real life. Except he was winning. December 2nd, 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon faced a coalition of Austrian and Russian armies that outnumbered him significantly. What did he do? He pretended to be weak, lured them into attacking, then crushed them so completely that the battle became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. After Austerlitz, Napoleon redrew the map of Europe. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for over 800 years. He made his brothers kings of various European kingdoms. He controlled territory from Spain to Poland. But Napoleon had one problem he couldn't solve: Britain. The British Navy ruled the seas, and Napoleon couldn't invade the British Isles. So he came up with the Continental System. Basically, he tried to destroy Britain economically by banning all European trade with them. This is where the cracks started to show. The Continental System hurt European economies, including France's. Countries started cheating. Portugal refused to comply, so Napoleon invaded Spain to get to Portugal. Big mistake. The Spanish campaign became what Napoleon himself called his Spanish ulcer. This wasn't traditional warfare. This was guerrilla fighting, and the Spanish people were absolutely brutal. French soldiers were picked off in ambushes, supply lines were constantly attacked, and entire armies just disappeared into the Spanish countryside. Meanwhile, other European powers were watching and learning. They studied Napoleon's tactics, reformed their armies, and started to coordinate against him. The student was about to become the teacher's worst nightmare. But Napoleon's biggest mistake was yet to come. In 1812, he decided to invade Russia. His reasoning? Tsar Alexander I was breaking the continental system and needed to be taught a lesson. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men from across his empire. It was called the Grande Armée, and it should have been unstoppable. The Russians had a different plan. They retreated, burned everything behind them, and let the Russian winner do the work. Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812, expecting the Tsar to surrender. Instead, he found an empty, burning city. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting a surrender that never came. Finally, with winter approaching, he ordered the retreat. What followed was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, fewer than 40,000 made it back in fighting condition. Disease, starvation, and freezing temperatures destroyed Napoleon's invincible army. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility died in the Russian snow. Sensing weakness, all of Europe turned against Napoleon. At the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of Nations, a coalition of Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish armies defeated Napoleon decisively. By 1814, enemy armies were marching on Paris itself. Napoleon's marshals, the men who had followed him to glory, finally said enough was enough. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated as emperor. The victorious powers exiled Napoleon to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy. They gave him the title of Emperor of Elba, which sounds generous until you realize Elba is only 86 square miles. It was like going from ruling most of Europe to being mayor of a small town. But here's the thing about Napoleon, he never knew when to quit. On March 1st, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with about 1,000 men and landed in France. What happened next was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, probably both. As Napoleon marched toward Paris, King Louis XVIII sent the army to stop him. But when the soldiers saw their former emperor, they threw down their weapons and joined him. By the time Napoleon reached Paris, he had an army again. This period became known as the 100 Days, and it culminated in the most famous battle in European history, Waterloo, June 18th, 1815. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's British army and Prussian reinforcements at Waterloo in Belgium. After years of victories, Napoleon's luck finally ran out. A combination of bad weather, tactical errors, and Wellington's defensive genius resulted in Napoleon's final defeat. The battle was close. Wellington himself said it was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. But close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. This time, the British weren't taking any chances. They exiled Napoleon to St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic Ocean over 1,000 miles from the nearest land. There, the man who once controlled most of Europe spent his final years dictating his memoirs and slowly dying of what was probably stomach cancer. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5th, 1821, at the age of 51. His last words were reportedly, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." If you enjoyed this deep dive into Napoleon's incredible life, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and see you next time.